Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I'm your host, the Wilder historian, Dr. Lucas Wilder, and last time I ended the Second Battle of Ream Station. In this episode, Robert E. Lee hopes to gain a substantial amount of meat to feed his army. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, and purchase something from one of my online stores. Every little bit helps. Thank you. Even before the Second Battle of Ream Station, the Weldon Railroad became unusable by the Confederacy to get supplies into Petersburg. Ulysses S. Grant had worked his way around to the south side of the town and grabbed hold of the railroad. A cavalry raid in June and July, led by Union General James Wilson, destroyed parts of the other railroad running into Petersburg, forcing Robert E. Lee to bring supplies, what little there were, by wagon. Lee knew that the fall harvest would bring in valuable foodstuffs to replenish not only the Army's rations, but support the civilian populations in both Petersburg and Richmond. However, much of that food would come from the Shenandoah Valley. Confederate General Jubal Early continued to occupy the valley and harass the North by staying close to the Virginia and Maryland border. Grant would send Philip Sheridan, his trusted cavalry commander, to take control of the Union forces opposing Early and threaten Lee's supply line from the valley. According to some sources, Lee could only provide his men with a pound of flour and a quarter pound of bacon per man per day. As Grant's forces inched closer to completely cutting Lee off from the rest of the Confederacy, Lee knew he was on borrowed time, made even shorter if he didn't get food to his army. Sergeant George Shadburn, the chief scout of Confederate Cavalry Commander Wade Hampton, discovered in early September a key component in keeping the Confederacy alive until more supplies could make their way into the city. He spotted 3,000 beef cattle lightly guarded behind the Union lines at Coggins Point. He brought this information to Hampton. Hampton was fairly new to commanding the Army of Northern Virginia's cavalry. The flamboyant Jeb Stuart held that distinction until he was mortally wounded at the Battle of Yellow Tavern in May 1864. Hampton stepped into that role, a position he had been eyeing for some time. He was born and raised in Charleston, South Carolina, to a wealthy family. His grandfather, Wade Hampton I, commanded troops in the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812, and his father, Wade Hampton II, fought in the War of 1812. Wade Hampton III studied law at South Carolina College, now the University of South Carolina, but didn't practice. Instead, his father assigned him to look over some of his various plantations in South Carolina and Mississippi. When his father died in 1858, Hampton inherited a vast amount of land and slaves. Before the war, aside from managing plantations, Hampton became a member of the South Carolina House of Representatives and the South Carolina State Senate. Hampton joined the South Carolina militia as a private when the Civil War broke out, but was given a commission as a colonel because of his social standing. He used his wealth and influence to raise a legion, a military unit made up of a few companies of infantry, a few of cavalry, and a battery of artillery. Hampton's legion participated in the First Battle of Bull Run, with Hampton rising through the ranks to eventually take command of a brigade of cavalry following the 7 days' battles. He continued to serve in the cavalry until he took command of the entire cavalry corps. Upon receiving Shadburn's information, Hampton went directly to Lee's headquarters. The two men discussed an operation in depth to launch a raid behind Union lines and retrieve the 3,000 head of cattle. Lee asked Hampton when he proposed to do the raid. Hampton responded as soon as he knew Grant was away from the Army, either visiting Washington or Sheridan in the valley. On September 13th, Shadburn returned to Hampton's headquarters near the Boydton Plank Road with information that Grant would be leaving his headquarters at City Point for the Shenandoah Valley early on September 15th. Shadburn's skill in gaining this information is miraculous, as Grant wouldn't notify Washington of his decision until 8 a.m. the next day on September 14th, and wouldn't inform Army of the Potomac Commander George Meade until 3 a.m. on the 14th. Hampton readied his men by 1 a.m. on September 14th. He organized 3,000 horsemen, as well as 60 mounted engineers armed with ropes and axes, as well as Stuart's famous horse artillery, commanded by Preston Chew. To divert the attention of the Federals, William Mahone's infantry division sidled to the right of the Confederate line and put pressure on the Union pickets in that sector. The ruse worked, and Hampton was able to move his command out on the Boydton Plank Road undetected. The South Carolinian rode at the head of his column with his trusted scout Shadburn beside him. The column of horsemen curved around the Union pickets and main Union line, darting south and east, passing the Weldon Railroad. They camped there on the night of September 14th, completely undetected, having ridden 20 miles that first day. Hampton hadn't told his men their mission, and wouldn't let them light fires for fear of word getting out about their intention. Waking early on September 15th, Hampton moved his column out and came to Belshell's Mill, owned by John Belshell's. John was acquainted with the swamps and roads of the area and quickly offered his services to Hampton to lead the cavalry to the cattle herd. The horsemen proceeded to Cook's Bridge over the Blackwater River. There, the Confederate troopers rested while engineers reconstructed the bridge over the river. Hampton intentionally took his troops that direction because he believed that Union forces wouldn't expect a raid to come from that area because Federal forces destroyed the bridge. At dusk on the 15th, the rebel horsemen crossed the river. Hampton then divided his command into three: Rooney Lee's troops on the left, James Deering's on the right, and Thomas Rosser in the center. His command would have to deal with the 1st District of Columbia cavalry that was blocking their way. The Federals were armed with Henry repeating rifles, but Hampton's men subdued them. It was reported by the Federals that the only defense of note was made by Major Baker at Sycamore Church, which, according to prisoners' statements, was very gallant and inflicted considerable loss upon the enemy. The 1st District of Columbia cavalry fought until most of the officers and men were surrounded and captured, inflicting, it is said, much damage to the enemy, as the advance was repulsed 3 times and were finally overpowered by numbers. Only about 150 Union soldiers guarded the herd itself. They were quickly subdued, and Hampton concentrated his force again as they began driving the cattle back to the Petersburg lines. They got to Cook's Bridge about 10 a.m. on the 16th and counted the cattle. There were somewhere near 2,500 of them. Hampton had the bridge reinforced to withstand the weight of the animals, and divided them up 4 ways to put less stress on the bridge. Once they were all across, they drove hard for the Jerusalem Plank Road, the most likely location where Union forces would try to stop them. Hampton sent troops under Rosser to block a Union attack from coming down the road, while the cattle were driven to the southwest. Just as Hampton guessed, Union cavalry, led by Henry Davies, were coming to intercept the cattle, but Rosser held them off. By 9 a.m. on September 17th, the cattle were safely in the entrenchments inside of Petersburg, a welcome sight by the hungry rebel soldiers. Over the course of the 3-day raid, Hampton traveled 100 miles, fought the enemy twice, captured 304 prisoners, most from the 1st D.C. Cavalry, 11 wagons, 200 Henry repeating rifles, 3 battle flags, and 2,486 fat steers, about 2 million pounds of beef. Confederate casualties were light, only 10 killed, 47 wounded, and 4 missing. Robert E. Lee commended Hampton for his invaluable service. Hampton himself wrote glowingly of his troops and their perseverance. Ulysses S. Grant returned to City Point and held a dinner inviting August Kautz, the cavalry commander tasked with guarding the cattle and whose cavalry pursued the Confederate raiders. Beef was absent from the meal. After everyone ate, Grant sat quietly puffing on a cigar until someone asked him how long it will take for him to starve Lee out of Richmond and Petersburg. Good-naturedly, Grant replied, "Forever, General, if you keep feeding Lee's army with beef."